Welcome, everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Two Philosophers, One Conversation, where we remind ourselves that philosophy has always been about the public good and try our best to make meaning in light of the fact that we are mortal beings. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest who is a friend of mine, someone whose work I respect and is really doing an amazing job of applying philosophy to public issues and public problems and embodied questions that we're asking right now. This is Mark Fagiano. He is currently a member of the philosophy faculty at University of Central Florida. He's also the founding director of a nonprofit called Empathy Activation that does some amazing work using virtual reality to create empathy situations and simulations for healthcare professionals focused on patient-centered care. He is currently finishing a book called Relational Empathy that is hopefully going to be out quite soon. And so, Mark, we're extremely excited to have you with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Aaron. I'm enjoying your podcast. I've watched a few already and look forward to watching the ones that follow this one.
Well, thanks again. Maybe we can start off by simply a big question that's simply asked. Why is empathy important today?
When I first started studying empathy, I found 127 distinctly different definitions of this word. And so then when I started to investigate, I'm like, so what should we do here? Do I select one of them and exclude the others? Do we take a broad perception or conceptualization of empathy as this phenomena, or do we narrow it down to certain things? So that's actually a debate in scholarship now. And I favor those, and I favor for myself, I adopt a broad conceptualization, which involves including rather excluding multiple types of experiences, and then thinking of those relationally as relational experiences. And so if we're talking about whether empathy is important today, it depends what sort of experience we're having. So just to make clear a couple of these different types of experiences that have been called empathy. For instance, if I think of empathy, say, as a type of contagion, like sometimes you can enter a room and people are pretty joyous, and all of a sudden maybe you weren't in a great mood and suddenly you're experiencing a little bit, maybe you're a bit happier. Well, that's a type of empathic contagion. Some people call it emotional contagion, but I didn't consciously do anything to get into the or catch that person's perspective. Neither did I imagine sort of what state they're in and then try to match that state. So that's quite different than from something, say, if I were to perspective take, right? So I can perspective take, and that involves a different, part of the brain. It involves an imagination and what it might be like to be someone else. That's quite different than just catching on, So people who call themselves empaths in online are really thinking about that first definition, that, they kind of like can catch the feeling. I don't know how you felt during the coronavirus, but when this hit, I immediately felt my body I felt like being pressed down, and I could feel the energy. And there was no cognitive process to where I arrived at that position, right? So those are just two different ways of thinking about empathy. I have taken the position of a pluralist and a radical contextualist. If we're going to talk about the value of empathy, let's talk about what specifically empathy means in these particular contexts and for these purposes and for whose interests, and what consequences would follow from thinking about those, if we're thinking about them as something moral, right? So just real quickly, is empathy a good thing? Is empathy moral? People love to ask this question. Well, if I just take, the idea, a lot of scholars talking about kind of being against empathy, but that's all about how they define it. So the empathy is first defined and then they're against it. But if you take a definition, say from C. Daniel Batson, who talks about empathic concern, and a lot of people talk about empathy as part type of care, then we're really talking about two different things. Right. And it really comes down to the context. So let me just give you one example. I know this is a long answer to a very short question, but if imagine you're out with your friends at a park, and you see a person riding a bike and they run into a brick wall. and you see this person, their body is in total pain. You know, maybe their shoulder is broken and their arm is behind dislocated and they're screaming out in pain. And you see the person, you might even catch the pain. You might even feel that pain empathically. And you might even imagine, wow, how that person might feel, how terrible it is. And then you just decide to walk away or drive away in your bike and not do anything. And then later in the day, someone says, hey, how was your day today? And you say, well, it was great. I was at the park, but I saw this guy, crash into a wall. It looked like he dislocated his shoulder. It's like, really? Well, what did you do? I didn't do anything, but I had empathy. I had empathy for the person. You see, so it depends upon these contexts. Once we introduce context is important, right? We start thinking about different sort of language, which are these language games about empathy, and in different contexts, they produce different meanings. So what I've done is take a historical approach, look at what's this, taking a genealogical approach of empathy, and looking at these different meanings and understandings, and then trying to come with an overarching theory of relational empathy.
I like the fact that when you articulate one of the definitions as a kind of catching, it does, of course, immediately, almost unconsciously, throws us back onto where we find ourselves in light of the pandemic. And one of the great possible outcomes of what's going on in the midst of all of the suffering and the threat of death and economic difficulties, we also see real global shared concern. We see Italians leaning out of their windows singing together. We see impromptu music coming up out of social distancing and people trying to still be connected. Mm-hmm. And we see neighbors dropping off food on people's front doors. And my sister, in fact, has started making art with her son and just randomly leaving it at people's porches as a way of trying to spread some sort of social connection. And it seems to me that kind of social connection certainly is grounded at some level in an attempt to take on some sort of shared relational approach to the human condition. And the virtual reality programs that you've created, tell us more about those, because it seems like what those are doing is precisely this kind of work, but without the embodied reality of a global crisis, that it throws us into these opportunities for the shared relationships without having to experience the actual risk and danger that we find right now.
Yeah. So one thing about a virtual reality, I don't think it's like a cure-all. If you're going to put on a headset, like everybody's going to sing Kumbaya from then on. So, but I do think that it is helpful in a few ways. First of all, there are certain experiences in life that I just do not have access to, right? I don't have access to having a doctor not trust me because I'm a woman. This is a really big situation. Big ethical problem in the healthcare system is that women, especially women of color, are not listened to when they see their doctors. It's a big, big problem. Okay, but I can, as a white male, I mean, I could think about maybe what that would be like. Mm-hmm. But what if I had an experience in which, an embodied, simulated experience where that I was that woman? Now, I mean, this only goes so far, and I don't think it would. I mean, you take off your headset and you're back to your everyday privileged life. But I think it can be helpful, at least to awaken some sort of experience through an embodied experience. I mean, hey, in philosophy, we do these thought experiments, right. And those are great. But what if we can create some visceral embodied experiences, right, in which people have to make actual decisions and then, sort of like with a choose your own adventure situation, have certain outcomes from that. So that's what we're working on now. Again, like, I don't think it's a cure-all for it, but it could make someone pause, So think of things like there are different sort of thought experiments. For instance, like the trolley car example. Unfortunately, I haven't had anybody volunteer for being the person on the track yet. We're going to see how we're going to maybe create some dummies. But the whole point is, like, you could create it without having someone get run over and just say, here you are, you're in the moment. Do you push it? You're getting a whole different experience, a bodily experience, than if you're just thinking about it. Yeah. And I've always wanted to have ethics labs. Biology has their labs and all these other sciences have their labs. And this is a moment where we can create so many different things. So my class actually did film a virtual, and I can give you the link to it when it's uploaded. There's all created by students for students, and these students created a situation where a woman is in a hospital room and she's not being listened to, and there are different types of experiences and people can make choices. We also did the Heinz Dilemma, which is up and running on empathyvision.com. And that's just kind of like a different way of thinking about the Heinz Dilemma. I mean, we can think of it conceptually, or we could try to be a little bit creative. It's not exactly the same situation, and try to put people in places where decisions. Do you steal the medicine? Here's what happens, or here's the possible consequences. This could be used for schools, for universities. Imagine incoming freshmen being able to be in a situation in a virtual world where they're at a party. Here's a person, you met this person and they drank too much at a party. What do you do? And then create these things before they happen. Look, I think that when it comes to morality, there's a lot of moral, we have what Batson calls moral maladies or moral failures. And I think what social scientists are seeing is that we don't really live up to our principles under these certain circumstances. So it's a serious issue in ethics today. What do we do about it, right? Because principles are usually rather abstract, number one. With these situations, we can actually have not just the thought experience, not just the principles, but see about when we're really faced with it, what kind of decisions will we make?
What do you think are the greatest social or cultural obstacles to cultivating, you might say, a empathetic culture?
I think that a couple things. I'd say just two things come to the top of my head right now. One is somehow in early education and throughout the education process have these sorts of things as part of the curriculum for kids at an early age. Second thing I'd say is kind of a little bit aligned with Hume when it comes to morality and distance. I think Rousseau said the same thing, right? I mean, it's time and space, the distance, the fact that a lot of situations don't immediately impact us. I think it takes a certain sort of person to start thinking about structure. How do we reconstruct society, reconstruct institutions to allow for opportunities to have your own thoughts challenged? Look, we're thrown into this world, and we have our biases. I think philosophers need to start with the fact that they are biased. We are all very biased. How do I get out? So I think one of the things is changing the institutional structure, changing the cultural conditions so that those opportunities, whether it's through VR or just face-to-face, which is better, can actually present themselves.
Yeah, I was actually interviewing the philosopher Aaron James for a forthcoming episode of Two Philosophers, One Conversation. And Aaron has this idea of what he calls asshole culture. And he says that, one of the good things that might come of this, global catastrophe with the pandemic is the opportunity to see some cracks in this asshole culture, that we no longer are defined by such a selfishness, such a self-protective attempt to only associate with those in our guild, our clan, our tribe, our party. And what we're seeing now is all of those facile ways that we associate starting to crack and break down because of the most fundamental way that we are associated, which is the shared condition of being human. And it seems to me that empathy might be a good name for what it looks like to overcome this asshole culture and live into some sort of space of shared norms, space of relational entanglements that cause even our disagreements, even our places where we challenge each other for good reasons sometimes, that those points of challenge are still anchored in some shared reality. And I'm wondering if the work you've done speaks maybe to the way in which we cultivate that sense of shared humanity. Is this something that gets overrun by proximity connections, right? Richard Rorty, for example, famously says that, people care about each other because they have mutual interest in some communal practice where, they might help their neighbor, not because their neighbor is human, but because their neighbor's kid plays soccer with their kid in the local YMCA club or something. But others, like Norman Garros, have suggested, no. It's the deeper humanity that we identify with and share that overruns those, local commitments and local entanglements. And this happens most often in times of crisis, in times of genuine fear and risk, like we face today. So I'm wondering what you think. Is there a way to balance perhaps the local proximity that might motivate empathetic relations, but at the cost of some shared human sense? On the one hand, with the shared human condition that risks at some level making less of those everyday local realities that tend to occupy most of our attention. How do we balance those together?
Well, the one thing about the shared is, just a word of caution from my senses, is that the shared at what expense? At what expense of ignoring differences, right? And then, of course, if there are shared sorts of unities or shared sorts of senses, who is in control of defining that reality? So that's just one thing to state from the beginning. But in regards to this sort of, I think one way to think about it is what Royce called wise provincialism, which he promoted, something locally, to put your efforts into that, what he called wise provincial, local situations, local things that we can do to help, and then maybe contrast it with cosmopolitanism, right? So again, when we're talking about that, shared humanity, that, thinking about how to create the good within that more cosmopolitan sense, I think we have to really look at structure. We have to look at institutions. Like, I was out the other day during, this crisis, and everybody's like, "How you doing? Are you being okay?" And it's kind of sad. Like, why do we have to have a major crisis to bring us all together? Shouldn't we be doing this all the time? Right. But it's true, So it's the idea. It's the fear of the unknown sometimes, which may think it be a negative thing, can really be a positive thing in the sense of bringing people together.
Yeah, well, let's push a little bit then on your caution about the question. So one of the worries that perhaps could be presented regarding empathy is the idea that one is always empathetic to someone, and yet one might argue that, well, look, some perspectives are more needed than others right now, or we might say some perspectives that have been historically marginalized or less attended to by those in power, that we need not simply empathy running in all directions, but perhaps there needs to be a kind of directionality or trajectory of empathy that we might say has a preferential option to the poor or the marginalized or the excluded from positions of power. It makes me think of that moment from the 2016 campaign where Bernie Sanders was speaking and there were some Black Lives Matters protesters. And instead of telling them, to sit down, what he did was stepped back and handed them the microphone until they gave their perspective and their account, in order to say, I think, look, it's not simply about you listening to me. It's about creating a space where those in power are more likely to listen to those who have traditionally been silenced. So does empathy have that kind of, you might say, morally directional overlay? Is there a way to put that in practice that creates some sort of attention and awareness? Or is empathy one of these one size fits all, and this is just one of the risks that attends it?
No, it's a great question, great comment. I think that, it really goes back to what I was saying at the beginning with these different relational contexts, right? So if Bernie Sanders would have, if there are Ku Klux Klan members with hoods and he said, "Oh, have a talk," then we don't, no. The morality of empathy, however defined, whether we think about it as contagion, whether we think about it perspective taking or connection, make feeling a connection. That's another type of empathy people talk about. Empathic inference. Even with artworks, people use in aesthetics, talk about the artwork, projecting yourself into an object. However they play out, it depends upon the context. And what we have today are philosophers and psychologists going back and forth talking about empathy is moral, empathy, I'm against it, I'm for it, yay. And hello, like there's context. One of his, I love William James, and one of his great works is The Philosopher of Moral Life. And the basic idea is that you can't make an ethical system up in advance of experience, but the moral is something that's felt. I mean, so it's not just simply empathy is the cure-all. We have to think about it contextually. We have to think about it in terms of also producing really bad experiences sometimes. Sometimes empathy can make someone be manipulated, obviously, and if we define it a certain way. If we define it another way, it can be the source of altruism. So again, like the options we have here are this, Aaron. We either select one and everybody agrees on it, which they won't, right? We select one, then someone else selects another one. It's like two ships passing in the night. They're talking about different things. So let's contextualize what we mean by empathy, right? In any sort of action, we talk about morality, we're talking about the flourishing or the good for humanity. There's always an exclusion of relations and people being left out. And I think we have to be aware of that the most.
I'd love to get your thoughts on how one cultivates this sense, whether even if we are contextual, even if we are aware of these challenges and the problems, that our very best attempts to be inclusive at some level by definition have to be exclusive, right? At least of views that, tolerate and promote exclusivism. So it's never a no cost type of decision when it comes to moral life. What are the kinds of practical embodied steps that can be taken for, my neighbor down the street who thinks philosophy is a waste of time? What are the steps that we can take to move ever closer toward an appreciation of empathy despite these challenges and difficulties for enacting it? But what is it that makes us empathetic in productive ways? How can we cultivate that socially, culturally, and as bodies in motion?
The first thing to say, I think, is that, people are what James called a bundle of habits, right? From Aristotle to James, habits. We are habits. We are our habits. We are what we repeatedly do. If one were to think about developing empathy, you think about getting people in situations through through institutional powers that can get them in situations where they can maybe have an experience that really makes them rethink something. I'll give you an example of that in a second, my time in Morocco. And I think the other thing that's important is just increasing types of perception, becoming more aware. First, you can't be empathic towards any object unless you're aware of it. So mindfulness comes in here, right? How do we, I think with mindfulness, it would be a very important first step to understand that, right? Someone that we know, right? Or someone that we meet may have certain needs, may have certain experiences. I need to first notice that. I need to first be mindful of that. And I need to be patient and actually want to experience empathy towards that person. Both as care and an understanding of the person. When I was in Morocco, I remember I had a situation where we were driving I was learning Arabic in Morocco, and we had on a train from Fez up to Tangier. And I remember, we had these trains and they have the rooms, and everybody kind of shares rooms. They're air conditioned, it's lovely. So we went in there, and there were three women. It was me and two other people, and there were three women already in there. We went in there and named them, and they had the complete niqba, right? The black and just the eyes showing. And, we sat down, and my Arabic was not so good, but I tried to say some things in Arabic. We started talking about things. This was during the George W. Bush time. So we both expressed our dislike of the president's actions, and that kind of built a connection. And then we talked about spicy tangines and how lovely they are. And then after we built that connection, I just wanted to ask him a question. I was just curious, and I was like, women in the West, they think that your outfit is an act of culture that oppresses you. And I'm sorry to be so bold, but I'm just wondering, well, what do you think about that? Yeah. And she says, no, this does not oppress me. This keeps my beauty only to expose to my husband. What would you have me do? Saying that moment something happened. So getting into positions, whether you put yourself in a position or being mindful of the position, it just kind of like shifted. I would have never thought that she would have answered that in that way. And then I never believed that, that was her reasoning, whatever you want to think about it, but it kind of like, it made something click. So the ability to have it where you go, empathic, I get this person, now I'm different, or what I was thinking before was ignorant, or at least misinformed.
Right. I mean, a couple thoughts as we close then. It seems to me that you've helped us think about a few things really, really well. One is that philosophy in ordinary times, and also times that are very far from ordinary, like we currently face today, philosophy helps us to recognize that context still matters, that things are rarely obvious. And when we take something for granted, that might be a moment where we're missing some question that could be asked. And secondly, the idea of even recognizing potentially in moments of disagreement, like I could imagine, a sex positive feminist encountering that woman on the train and really having a critical reaction to her view and her comment, and yet recognizing even when I think something might be false or even potentially dangerous or even wrong, the idea that we can understand why someone would hold a different view allows us to recognize that very, very few people are unreasonable. People who hold false beliefs usually hold them for reasons that if we understood, we wouldn't necessarily hold their view, but we would understand how it would be reasonable for someone to hold that view in light of what might be false premises, right? So something that I often get a lot of inspiration from in my own thinking and my own living is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who of course was killed during World War II, right there at the very end, and had participated in an attempt, even as a pacifist, participated in an assassination plot to kill Hitler. He was offered the opportunity to come to Union Theological Seminary and avoid basically the worst of the atrocities in World War II. And he was invited by Reinhold Niebuhr, an American theologian, and Bonhoeffer turned it down. And when he turned it down, he said something really fascinating. He said that we've got to be careful not to respond as Martin Luther did. Here I stand, I can do no other. But instead, we've got to remind ourselves, and this is a quote he offers, he says, we can always do otherwise. And that reminder, we can always do otherwise. That doesn't mean that we don't stand with confidence, but it recognizes that true confidence is grounded in humility. It recognizes that when I stand somewhere, I'm recognizing there are other legitimate places one might stand. And empathy, I think, maybe as I understand it, not a specialist in empathy studies, but as a philosopher who does think that empathy of some form is a value to my life and the model I want to set for my son, empathy is the ability to recognize that what I take as obvious might simply reflect the privileges and the experiences that I have had. And that doesn't make me right or wrong, but it may not even give me pause about holding the view that I hold. But when I am empathetic, I'm able to recognize that my view is not the only view. And wow, if we're going to crack those frames of asshole culture, of self-protective, isolated, privileged culture, where what really matters is the success that I can achieve for myself, even if it comes at the cost of others. If we are going to crack that and start to break that frame down, I think it requires that we do start inviting ourselves first before we turn to others, recognizing of our own views that I'm likely to hold plenty of false views too. And I might view something very differently had I grown up in a different space, in a different body, with different sorts of capacities, if I were not neurotypical. Whatever the experiences that have given rise to where I find myself standing, it's important still empathetically to remember we can stand elsewhere. We can do otherwise. And in that moment of recognition, we're able, I think, to invite others to continue in the conversation with us. so that we might have our views changed if the reasons are strong enough. We might have our experiences expanded by interacting with and encountering other bodies and other histories.
And that what you just say is so important, because that is an avenue to something we haven't talked yet. It's my last chapter of the book, but it's democracy as a way of life, right? And thinking in terms of having that openness to the possibility that I could be someone else. I mean, I don't know if everybody has this problem, but I wake up often in the morning, like, how can I have been me? I mean, I just am me, and I was born in this situation, and it's just so very strange, you know. And the fact that I could be someone else, and if I were someone else, I would hold different views, and I would see the world differently. So, and it just happens to be, I have so many people who have helped me along the way, and it's so much luck. Once you have that realization, I think the next movement is, what are other people thinking? How are other people empowered or disempowered in society? And there we go with democracy. So I think this whole train of thinking we're talking about here really talks about the need for the democracy, not just as something where we go pointing, making a choice, and I voted and I put the sticker on too, but beyond that, in daily life, how do we think about living democratically? How do we think about empowering, again, those people, whether they're students or people near us or people on the other side of the world? How do we think about empowering people so they can live flourishing life? Because there's a lot of oppression, there's a lot of structures that hold people down. How can we live it on a daily basis? And I think part of that desire, right, comes from, first of all, the curiosity of what other people are experiencing in their situation. And then also, right, as you've been saying, right, a realization of the fact that I could be that person. I could be others. And so I think this leads to important conversations about democracy as a way of living life.
It's important that we cultivate curiosity, that we recognize complexity, and that we strive for deliberative and democratic conversations, because those three things perhaps are where empathy finds its anchor and finds its root. Mark, thank you so much for being with us. You remind me to get outside myself and recognize that there is a world that is not my experience, but one that I've got to figure out better ways to experience. So thank you again, Mark, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. I always enjoy speaking with you, and good luck with this project. And I can't wait to watch the next episodes. Stay tuned, everyone.
Absolutely. And to everybody, thank you so much again for watching this episode. We are going to continue to interview philosophers and theologians and other scholars and people working in the field that help us think well about where we find ourselves today. So as always, philosophy has always been for the public good, and we've got to do our best to make meaning because we are mortal beings. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.